Hello everyone, HP Hollow here, and welcome back to wherever you've been watching this. Tonight, reading more of Monster Punk Horizon Book 2, and I'm actually going to read two chapters tonight because they're both itty bitty. So once this chapter is finished, hang on wherever you're watching, and I will get the second chapter loaded up. But we'll, I guess, go ahead and get to it. We are starting with Chapter 3, which is titled The Goddess of Skull Harbor. They hustled back after that, and Jaz barreled through the jungle gate like the Screecher itself was behind her. She had a prank to pull, and she'd already held it off for too long. She skidded to a stop at a sign marked Skull Harbor Apartments and Condominiums. Cozy and too clean, the sign had an air of manufactured rusticness that made it look like it belonged to one of those artificially welcoming, overplanned complexes on the wondrous continent. Perhaps such a complex had been there at one point, but the scars of occasional monster break-ins and frequent hunter mischief shone on the current and obvious lack of civil planning. A sprawling mess of structures improvised from monster parts and other natural resources splashed along the back of the harbor and up the ragged ridges of its cliffs, as if they'd been built so fast no one had stopped to think about building codes. Or, more likely, as if the builders figured they'd be destroyed anyway, so why bother with planning? Pix and Jaz had lucked out the week they'd arrived, finding a vacant stone and bone cottage that sat mostly flat on a jut of rock, except for a side porch that had been finagled up with a wooden frame that put Pix in mind of a beach house stretching to escape from floodwaters. She didn't go on that porch very often, though she had fitted it with a cheap string of gem lights to make it look slightly less terrifying. Intricate networks of stairs, rope ladders, zip lines, and chain lifts connected the ground to the various housing tiers. Jaz shot up one chain lift to the cottage, and soon Pix saw her silhouette through the gossamer curtains on the porch, rummaging through a series of trunks like a sloppy thief looking for a very specific thing, and finally finding it. Pix knew how fast Jaz could get into and out of clothing, so she waited at the base of one zip line. Soon Jaz slid back down, messily clad in a sparkling, tasseled red dress that looked like it had started life as a prom dress, but upon its midlife crisis decided to transition into lingerie. There were slits and windows in so many places that as many times as Pix had seen this dress, she still couldn't figure out how it managed to stay together, and she was pretty sure that back at the canteen there were bets running on which boob would fall out first. Though they'd probably have to adjust the parameters of their bets, because if the same slits were any indication, Jaz had just thrown the dress on over her bikini armor. Jaz leapt to a stop in front of Pix and struck a sultry pose. "How do I look?" "Like you're ready to make a ruckus." "That's what I was going for!" "I think they've moved the Isekai to the canteen," Pix observed, peering through her goggles to note the crowd that had amassed there. "Then let's do this thing," Jaz declared, and so they headed up toward the crowd. Indeed, they arrived to the cheers of an eager audience. The tables of the canteen were packed, scattered with mounds of food and bags of gems as the hunters prepared to take or surrender their bets. The Madmiral had pulled out her chalkboard and was keeping official track of the bets and odds, a necessary service, provided by a necessary person, since harbor-spanning brawls had broken out over unmoderated bets in the past, and no one was going to challenge the authority of the old legendary hunter so badass she wore the tanned skin of an eldritch titan and had its magical stellaric opal implanted directly into her chest. Hati presided over the centermost table, where the guest of honor had been strewn amidst the food she and her companions had amassed, as if he was to be part of the meal. To her left sat Dwayne, who flashed a perky grin that looked out of place but still pleasant on his ferocious, hairy, bat-fanged face. He'd recently re-braided his beard, Pix noticed, perhaps to make himself look less terrifying for the Skyborn, but the contents of his flagon had left a thick red dribble on his mouth, which crumpled up that whole attempt, stomped on it, and then set it on fire. Not even his comfy band shirt and jeans could counteract that savage image. Well, it was the thought that counted, she supposed. Dwayne wasn't a terrifying person, and one didn't even have to know him that long to figure it out. But every single aspect of his physical appearance combined to suggest otherwise, which was ironic because as personalities went, he was one of the best people to greet newcomers to Skull Harbor. Especially compared to the final present member of the Dragon Pig Pirates. Dragon Pig himself crouched on the young man's chest as if guarding him, though whether it was to protect him from being eaten or so Dragon Pig could eat him himself, Pix didn't know. Now that Pix watched, she realized she recognized the cute little snorts that indicated he was sniffing, rooting around the shape as if he smelled something he could convince Darla to work into a nice stew. Now, it probably wasn't the literal case, Pix hoped, but then it was often hard to tell with Dragon Pig. Dwayne, at least, had shown some consideration for the Skyborn, positioning an umbrella over the table so he wouldn't burn in the oppressive suns. He certainly looked the type to be vulnerable to the elements. The Isekai's skin was nearly as pale as Pix's, and while his physique wasn't necessarily weak, it was definitely that of someone whose life had not required a lot of physical work. He'd fallen from the sky in a generic white button-down shirt and black slacks, and it was nothing short of miraculous luck that had kept the glasses on his unmemorable face. Perhaps the only thing that was notable about him was the electric blue streak that split the black hair falling over his forehead, and the strange, stylized skull mask perched on the side of his head, which would at least make him easy to tell apart from any other isekais that fell from the sky. The isekais were so named because every time the skies spat one out, their first words were usually some equivalent of, "Oh my god, am I in an isekai?" The hunters didn't actually know what the word meant in its original context, but it was such a common question that it was the most betted upon topic on the Madmiral's board, and had naturally become the nickname applied to that particular type of Skyborn. Of all the Skyborns, the average-looking, dark-haired young men that made up the isekais tended not to last very long. Where most Skyborns reacted to their plight like normal people, which was to say, panicked and then slowly adapted to their new lives, the isekais often acted as if they'd anticipated being yanked into a new world, and immediately started gathering gear and figuring out how to unlock their capital S skills and OP abilities, whatever that meant, as if the simple fact of their being here granted them some extra talents. Strangely, they all seemed to come from the same world, too, as if the skies had a particular fascination with wherever Japan was. But regardless of where they came from, their heroic sense of destiny usually led them to one particular quick fate. Most went out into the jungle expecting easy wins, only to be ambushed and eaten by a pack of Parashkas within their first hour. Given the regularity of that occurrence, the conversations Pix heard bubbling around the canteen bewildered her. As she took her seat at the central table, she heard every other table in the canteen chattering about the new isekai's lineage, wondering if he was a lucky purebred human, especially since that distinct blue streak seemed to grant him main character hair that the others lacked. Again, whatever that meant. Pix didn't follow isekai terminology all that much. The one exception to the excitement waved at her from across the canteen at a table full of rowdy frat men. The frat men were a huge party of pals who'd studied lapidary arts at Mysteric University and brought the spirit of the lapidary frat with them when they graduated. Their essential purpose in Skull Harbor was to cut the gems hunters mined to harness their internal magical properties, but when they weren't cutting gems and making them into tactical jewelry, they were often testing the limits of loud Skull Harbor stupidity. Granted, it was sometimes smart stupidity. There were countless unique, customized weapons and armor sets floating around that existed solely because a frat man had taken a dare to find a cut that could accomplish a bizarrely specific feat, like the cut that turned the common Ignifex gem into the foundation for Sacha's rocket-powered twin blades. But the frat men were also how the hunters found that the Screecher's armor was impervious to blunt physical damage, largely because their first strategy when facing the thing was to just run up and hit it a lot. Pix only knew of one frat man with any sense of self-preservation, or really any sense at all, and it was the gray-skinned half-orc waving at her now. She returned the wave with a small blush. They'd met Kilvester last month during the Screecher siege, when he'd more or less joined their party in an attempt to flirt with Jaz. He'd phrased it as needing a guinea pig for some novel gem cuts, and maybe that was true, but the subtext was obvious. Jaz, however, was attracted to few things other than snacks, procrastination, and monster hunting, so she'd let him down quickly. To his credit, that didn't change the way he interacted with them, except to eliminate attempted flirts, of course, and he'd joined them every now and again since, whenever he tired of the hijinks of his frat mates. Pix didn't mind that, though. He had a few years of experience on them, and thus helped a lot when they were fighting new monsters. Of course, it helped that he was half Fey, too, which accounted for his smaller-than-usual tusks and the glamorous cascade of black hair that flowed off the back of his head like he'd looted it from the cover of a Bodice Ripper novel. His nose might have been lumpy from a few childhood fights, but as orcs went, he was hot, and Pix had no objection to there being a hot, decent dude in the party. Especially if he was chill enough to balance Jaz. Jaz didn't sit next to Pix. She struck a foot atop the table as if to claim it and announced, "Greetings, minions, your goddess is here." A cheer and flagons rose up around the canteen, except from Pix and Kilvester. They rolled their eyes. "What are you going to be the goddess of this time?" one of the frat men shouted around Kilvester's bicep. "I don't know," Jaz said, then gestured dramatically. "Bring out the box." The crowd cheered again, and a cluster of frat men quickly cleaned up the cards on their table and formed up as if for a procession. They presented the box containing the cards to Jaz like it was some sort of holy relic, and then backed away quickly, as if opening the box would unleash a burst of such great power that mere mortals could not survive the experience. The box had fallen from the sky around the time Pix and Jaz had come to the monstrous continent. Its contents, a collection of white cards and black fill-in-the-blank cards, gave Pix the impression that it was some sort of party game in whatever world it had fallen from. But the instruction manual hadn't fallen with it, so the hunters had taken to using it for a variety of different purposes, including playing charades, choosing dares, and selecting what kind of goddess Jaz would be whenever a new Isekai fell from the sky. Thus far, she'd been the goddess of meth, these hoes, a micro-pig wearing a tiny peacoat and booties, throwing raisins at a man until he loses touch with reality, and some guy flying in on a tiger made of lightning. Of course, none of them had any idea what most of those things were, so she'd had to improvise. Thus, meth became an advanced, nearly metaphysical form of mathematics. These hoes became a colossal throne of gardening tools she claimed to have fused from all the farms she and her berserker hordes had conquered, but in fact she'd only gotten from the botanical researchers in exchange for a whole lot of dung. A micro-pig wearing a tiny peacoat and booties just involved her lavishing worshipful attention on Dragon Pig dressed in one of his seasonal costumes. Throwing raisins at a man until he loses touch with reality was, well, that. But fortunately the man's mental fortitude was such that he returned to reality with admirable speed. Some guy flying in on a tiger made of lightning was... Actually, she hadn't done much with that one except don her most flamboyant, stylish armor and deliver her monologue from the back of a sleeping bull tiger, which she'd convinced a bunch of frat men to capture and sedate simply by offering them free ale and some chips from her stash of imported wondrous continent snacks. The only card she'd ever turned down was two goblins sharding into a bucket. Not because she couldn't figure out how to interpret it, but because she couldn't figure out why such a card would exist in the first place, and the canteen had spent so much time debating the philosophical implications of that card that the Isekai had woken up mid-discussion and ordered a pint and plate of food from Darla before they'd even noticed he was awake and contributing to the conversation. That Isekai had survived longer than most, simply through the happy accident of joining up with the frat men, who fought in such a way that they became each other's meat shields, until the day he discovered that while he was very good at being meat, he was not very good at being a shield, especially against a pissed-off saber wolf, which he'd tried to befriend because it looked like the kind of companion a chosen one should have. "You don't think this new guy's another chosen one, do you?" one of the frat men said to the canteen in general. "Nah, he looks like one of those wannabe hero types," one of his companions replied with a sneer. "Accidental hero at best. You can always tell them from the chosen ones because they at least look capable even if they aren't. This guy looks like he hasn't seen natural sunlight in his entire life." "I hope he's an untimely death one," Jaz interjected. "I'd rather handle the ones facing existential crises than the ones who assume they're here to save the world. They always think they're brought here by some divine entity when it's really like, nah, dude, you're just here because the laws of space-time sneezed and farted you out at the same time." The entire canteen laughed and sneered at that, even Pix and Kilvester. The hunters might have their disagreements, usually about what weapon was best, the best ways to optimize armor sets, or which monster would make the best girlfriend, assuming there were hot anthropomorphic versions of monsters, which was a more common discussion than Pix cared to hear. But the one thing they regularly agreed on was that chosen ones were more fart than hero. As they returned to their bets and drinks, Pix wondered what kind of Isekai the new man would be, if he'd even say the fateful words that would put him in that category. They'd find out soon, for he began to shift on the table, like someone about to wake up, drifting in and out of consciousness as Hadi's sleep glitter wore off. Slowly the canteen came to attention around him. The Madmiral took her post by her chalkboard, ready to monitor for the results of the bets placed on her table, and Jaz leapt onto the tabletop and twisted her spine into the most sultry, welcoming pose she was capable of. The young man's eyes opened. He did not react immediately, even to the provocative side of Jaz. He blinked and stared for a bit, clearly thinking and processing his situation. And then he groaned, "Oh my god, am I in an isekai?" And that is chapter 3. Stick around, I'm going to be reading chapter 4 in just a few minutes. But again, if you have to leave, thank you for watching this one.